Some rich children, while passing by a house under construction, knocked a man off a ladder and attacked a woman. When the mask she was wearing fell off, one of them saw her face and shouted that Beatrice, an 18-year-old girl from a humble family, always had big dreams but few opportunities. On a warm summer night, she decided to go out with some friends to a nightclub in the city center, hoping to have some fun and maybe forget about life's challenges for a while. In the middle of the crowd and the flashing lights, Beatrice caught the eye of Charles, a young man with a sophisticated look and a charming smile. Charles, from a wealthy family, was used to getting everything he wanted, but when he saw Beatrice, he felt something different. She wasn't like the other girls he knew. There was a simplicity and honesty in her eyes that intrigued him. Their eyes met several times before Charles gathered the courage to approach her. "Hi, can I buy you a drink?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Beatrice, a bit surprised, accepted with a shy smile. From the moment they started talking, their conversation flowed naturally, and soon they felt as if they had known each other for a very long time. Amidst laughter and shared stories, Beatrice and Charles lost track of time. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and their emotional connection felt as if they had known each other for years. They danced together, each song seeming shorter than the last as they got to know each other better. "You have a special sparkle in your eyes when you talk about your dreams," Charles said, gently holding Beatrice's hand. "I believe you can achieve anything you want, as long as you believe in it with all your heart." Beatrice was touched by his words. No one had ever shown such faith in her. "Thank you, Charles. When you say that, you make me feel like anything is possible." The night went on, and the more they talked, the more they realized that despite their differences, they had a lot in common. They were both searching for something more in life, something that money or the lack of it couldn't buy. At the end of the night, as they walked out of the club, Charles turned to Beatrice. "Can I see you again?" he asked, hopeful. Beatrice smiled, feeling her heart beat faster. "I'd love that." And so, on that magical night, an intense and unexpected love story began, intertwining the destinies of Beatrice and Charles in ways neither of them could have imagined. The relationship between Beatrice and Charles blossomed quickly. Less than a year after their meeting at the nightclub, Beatrice discovered that she was pregnant with Charles's child. When she shared the news with Charles, his eyes filled with emotion. "We're going to have a baby, Charles. We're going to be a family," Beatrice said, holding his hands tightly. Charles, although initially surprised, soon found himself overwhelmed with happiness. "That's amazing, Beatrice. Let's get married. I want to be by your side and our child's side." The wedding was simple but full of love. Beatrice, now 19, wore a modest white dress, but her smile lit up the entire room. Charles, always elegant, couldn't take his eyes off her, holding her hands firmly as they exchanged vows. "I promise to love and protect you, Beatrice, today and always," Charles said, looking deeply into her eyes. Beatrice responded, her voice filled with emotion. "I promise the same, Charles. We'll build a life together, for us and for our baby." The ceremony was brief but meaningful. After exchanging rings, Beatrice and Charles shared a passionate kiss, sealing the union they both believed would last forever. The few friends and family present clapped, and Beatrice's tears of happiness were visible to everyone. However, not everyone shared the couple's joy. Charles's family, especially his mother, Eleanor, watched the scene with reserved expressions. Eleanor, in particular, couldn't hide her disapproval. "A girl from a humble background like hers will never be good enough for my son," she whispered to her husband, who simply nodded in silent agreement. But that night, nothing seemed capable of shaking Beatrice and Charles's happiness. They danced together, laughed, and dreamed about the future. "I love you, Beatrice. It feels like I was born for this moment with you," Charles said as he held her close. Beatrice smiled, feeling safe in her husband's arms. "I love you too, Charles. This feels like a dream." And so, with promises of eternal love and a future full of hope, Beatrice and Charles began their journey as husband and wife, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. The happiness of Beatrice and Charles's marriage was soon tainted by the veiled disdain of Charles's family. Beatrice's humble background was an insurmountable obstacle for them. Shortly after the wedding, Beatrice noticed the cold stares and whispered comments whenever she entered Charles's parents' home. "She doesn't belong in our circle," Eleanor would say loudly, with a tone of disdain as Beatrice walked by. At a family dinner, Beatrice, trying to please everyone, brought a dessert she had learned to make from her grandmother. Eleanor, after tasting it, commented with a forced smile, "Interesting. A different taste." Charles squeezed Beatrice's hand under the table, trying to comfort her, but she felt the tears welling up. After dinner, Charles confronted his mother. "Mum, why can't you accept Beatrice, even after we've married? She's my wife and the mother of your grandchild," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. Eleanor, with a serious expression, replied, "Charles, you deserve someone who's your equal, someone who understands and values our way of life. She'll never be good enough for you, and I won't hide how I feel." Charles shook his head, disappointed. "I love her, Mum. That should be enough for you to respect us." But Charles's words seemed to have no effect. With every visit, Beatrice was met with fake smiles and sarcastic remarks. Once, Eleanor said, "You must miss your old life. I imagine our home feels a bit too big for you." Hurt, Beatrice simply replied, "My life has changed, but the love I have for Charles and our child is what matters." These constant interactions began to wear down Beatrice, who felt that Charles wasn't protecting her. She confided her pain to Charles, who, though supportive, felt torn between his love for his wife and loyalty to his family. "B, I know it's hard, but please, try to understand them," he pleaded, holding her in his arms. Beatrice sighed, feeling the weight of the situation. "I'll never give up on you, Charles. I just hope that one day your family sees how much I love you and how dedicated I am to you and our child, and that you understand that your family now is me and our child." Despite Charles's words, Beatrice knew that being accepted by his family was a distant dream. Each encounter with them was a test of her strength, and she remained determined to prove her worth, even in the face of constant prejudice and rejection. 2 years had passed since Beatrice and Charles's wedding. During this time, Beatrice had faced rejection and oppression from Charles's family, especially from Eleanor. Each day was a silent struggle, and Beatrice felt her spirit slowly being crushed by the constant disapproval. On a grey afternoon, Beatrice and Charles were in the living room, once again discussing his family's behavior. "Charles, I can't take it anymore," Beatrice said, tears in her eyes. "Your mother treats me like I'm invisible, or worse, like I'm a problem, like I'm an animal." Charles sighed, running his hands through his hair. "I know, Beatrice, I've tried talking to her, but she's stubborn." Beatrice wiped her tears, her voice shaky but firm. "I love you, Charles, but love can't survive alone in such a toxic environment. I can't keep going like this. You can't protect your wife and you can't let go of your mother. I need to think about our child's well-being and my own. I can't raise our son in that environment." Charles's expression changed from sadness to desperation. "Are you talking about divorce? You want to separate because of my mother?" Beatrice nodded slowly, her heart aching with each word. "Yes, Charles. I never wanted it to come to this, but I don't see another way. I feel suffocated, and that's not fair to anyone, especially Richard. Are you willing to stand up to your mother for me and your son?" Charles was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the floor. Finally, he looked at Beatrice, his voice filled with pain. "I don't want to lose you, but I understand you need to do what's best for you. If you want to leave, the choice is yours." The following days were tough. Beatrice began looking for a lawyer, while Charles tried to focus on work, but his mind always drifted back to his wife and child. When Eleanor learned of Beatrice's decision, she didn't hide her satisfaction. "I knew she wasn't right for this family, a weak woman with no future," she remarked coldly. Beatrice, determined, found strength in her love for Richard. "I need to be strong for him," she told herself. One rainy night, as she was packing her things, Richard ran up to her. "Mummy, why are you sad?" Beatrice hugged him tightly, feeling the tears run down her face. "I'm doing this so we can be happy, my love. I'll always be here for you." Finally, the day of the divorce arrived. In the courtroom, Beatrice and Charles exchanged sad but understanding looks. "I hope one day we can find peace and you can understand me," Charles said, holding Beatrice's hand for the last time. Beatrice smiled sadly. "I hope so too, Charles. Take care of yourself." And so, with a heavy heart, Beatrice said goodbye to a chapter of her life, ready to face the challenges ahead, always keeping her love for her son as her greatest strength. After the divorce, Beatrice dedicated herself entirely to caring for Richard. Working hard to support herself and her son, she did everything possible to create a safe and loving environment for him. However, Eleanor, her former mother-in-law, had other plans. One day, Beatrice received a court notice. Eleanor was suing for custody of Richard, claiming that Beatrice was financially incapable of taking care of the boy. The news was a devastating blow. "She can't do this, Charles," Beatrice exclaimed, her eyes full of tears, as she met Charles in the park to discuss the matter. "Richard is all I have." Charles, visibly uncomfortable, tried to comfort Beatrice. "I don't agree with this, Bea. I know you're a great mum, but my mother, she has influence and resources. She believes Richard would be better off with her." Beatrice took a deep breath, feeling the anger and frustration rise. "This isn't fair, Charles. She never liked me. And now she's trying to take my son. I won't let that happen. And once again, you do nothing. You never stand up to help me." In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Eleanor, with her rigid posture and cold stare, presented her arguments confidently. "Your Honor, my former daughter-in-law Beatrice is a young woman without financial stability, living in a dangerous area. Richard needs a safe home, where he won't lack resources for his education and well-being. I can offer him a quality education in private schools to ensure a future for this child, far better than the disorganized home his mother provides." Beatrice, sitting next to her lawyer, felt her heart racing. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up, trying to stay calm. "Your Honor, I may not have the same financial resources as my former mother-in-law, but I have something money can't buy: love and dedication. Richard is my life, and I do everything to make sure he's safe and happy." The judge looked at Beatrice, considering her words carefully. "I understand your position, Ms. Beatrice. However, we need to consider what is best for the child. Both parents have equal rights over the child." Eleanor, with a smug smile, looked at Beatrice, certain of her victory. "Your Honor, I can assure you that Richard will have everything he needs under my care and my son's." Beatrice didn't back down. "Richard needs love, a mother who knows him and loves him unconditionally. I work hard every day to give him the best I can." After hours of testimony and arguments, the judge announced that the decision would be made after a recess. Beatrice left the courtroom with a heavy heart, but determined to fight until the end. "I won't let them take my son away from me," she said firmly, holding Richard in her arms. Eleanor, seeing Beatrice's determination, muttered to herself, "We'll see who wins this battle, you filthy pauper." The fight for Richard's custody was just beginning, and Beatrice knew she had to be prepared for anything. The custody hearing for Richard was set for a rainy morning. Beatrice prepared herself as best as she could, gathering documents and testimonies that proved her love and dedication to her son. However, what she didn't know was that Eleanor had a dark plan to ensure her victory. In the courtroom, Beatrice was nervous but determined. Charles was present, sitting next to Eleanor, whose expression was one of absolute confidence. The judge entered, and the hearing began. Eleanor's lawyer presented her case with precision. "Your Honor, my client is a woman of means and stability. Ms. Beatrice, on the other hand, has a history of unstable jobs and financial difficulties. My client believes she can provide a better environment for Richard." Beatrice, expecting this argument, was ready to respond. "Your Honor, I may not be rich, but I work hard and do everything for my son. He is well cared for and loved." Then Eleanor stood up to speak. "Your Honor, I'd like to present some additional evidence." She handed a folder to the judge containing supposed financial reports and statements. The judge examined the documents and frowned. "Ms. Beatrice, it appears there is evidence here that you have faced more serious financial difficulties than you mentioned. This includes overdue bills and issues with paying rent." Beatrice was stunned. "That's not true. I have my receipts here that show I'm up to date with all my bills." She handed her documents to the judge, but Eleanor wasn't finished. "Your Honor," Eleanor continued in a calculated tone, "there are also testimonies from neighbors and acquaintances claiming that Beatrice often leaves Richard alone at home while she goes to work." Beatrice felt her blood run cold. "That's a lie. I would never leave my son alone. I always arrange for someone to look after him when I'm away." The judge seemed confused but intrigued. "Let's hear these testimonies." Several people were called, all clearly influenced by Eleanor. "I've seen Richard alone many times playing in the garden, left at the mercy of any danger," said one neighbor, avoiding eye contact. Beatrice stood up, her eyes filled with tears and anger. "These people are lying, Eleanor. You know you're making all of this up. How can you be so cruel?" Eleanor replied coldly, "I just want what's best for my grandson, Beatrice. Perhaps you should think more about that." The hearing was adjourned for the judge's deliberation, and Beatrice left the courtroom with a heavy heart. Charles ran after her. "B, I didn't know my mother would do this." Beatrice turned to him, her eyes full of pain. "Charles, I know you're caught in the middle, but Richard is our son. How can you let this happen? You need to tell the truth to the judge." Charles lowered his head, unable to respond. Beatrice knew the fight was far from over, but she wouldn't give up. "I'll prove she's lying and that witch will go to prison," she promised herself with renewed determination. Eleanor, watching from a distance, smiled to herself. She was confident she had secured the victory, but she underestimated Beatrice's strength and resilience. The judge's final decision was a devastating blow to Beatrice. After reviewing the testimonies and documents presented, he declared that Richard's custody would be granted to Charles and Eleanor. Beatrice felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. In the courtroom, the judge's voice echoed coldly and definitively. "Considering the evidence presented and the sworn testimonies, I believe that the most stable and secure environment for Richard at this time is with his father. Miss Beatrice, you will have visitation rights, but primary custody will be with the father." Beatrice couldn't believe what she was hearing. "No, this isn't fair. They lied, Your Honor. I'm Richard's mother. I would never abandon him." Eleanor, with a look of triumph, just watched in silence. Charles, visibly uncomfortable, tried to console Beatrice after the hearing. "B, I'm so sorry. I didn't want it to end like this." Beatrice pushed Charles's hand away. "You could have done something, Charles. You could have defended the truth. Now our son will grow up without his mother." In the days that followed, Beatrice had to endure the pain of watching Richard leave for Eleanor's house. She packed his favorite toys and clothes, tears falling silently as she folded each item. "I'll see you soon, my love," she whispered, kissing Richard's forehead before he was taken away by Charles. Richard, confused, looked at his mother with big, sad eyes. "Mummy, why do I have to go?" Beatrice struggled to keep her voice steady. "It's just for a little while, darling. Mummy's going to fight to bring you back home soon." Charles placed Richard in the car, avoiding Beatrice's gaze. "I'll take good care of him, B, I promise." Beatrice didn't respond. She just stood on the pavement, watching the car drive away, taking her son and a piece of her heart with it. In the months that followed, Beatrice threw herself into work, trying to fill the void left by Richard's absence. During the supervised visits, Beatrice did everything she could to make each moment special. She took Richard to the park, read his favorite stories, and showered him with love. But the time was always too short, and the goodbyes painful. "Mummy, I want to stay with you," Richard would say, hugging her tightly. "I know, my love. And I'm doing everything I can to make that happen," Beatrice would reply, her voice choked with emotion. Meanwhile, Eleanor seized every opportunity to reinforce the idea that Beatrice was inadequate. "Richard, your mother is trying, but she can't give you what we can. Here you have everything you need," she would say, trying to poison the boy's mind. Eleanor, using her influence, obtained an injunction, with false testimonies claiming that Beatrice was dangerous and was influencing the child to run away from home. The judge, without a hearing, decided that Beatrice could no longer visit her son. When Beatrice received the letter, she broke down in tears and vowed to herself that one day she would get revenge on Eleanor. But Beatrice's love for Richard was unshakable. Each day away from him only strengthened her determination to fight against all odds and prove that she was the best person to raise her son. Beatrice knew the battle was far from over, and she was ready to face anything. Years passed, and Richard grew up under the care of Charles and Eleanor, far from Beatrice's constant affection. From a young age, he was reminded of the narrative that his grandmother had worked so hard to build, that his mother had abandoned him. This idea took root deeply in his mind, shaping his perception of Beatrice. One morning, when Richard was about 10 years old, he found an old photograph of his mother in a family album. "Who is this?" he asked, curious, showing the photo to Eleanor. Eleanor, with a calculated sigh, replied, "That's your mother, Richard, don't you remember? She decided she couldn't take care of you and left us with that responsibility." Richard frowned. "Why would she do that?" Charles, who was nearby, tried to intervene. "Richard, the truth is more complicated than that. Your mother loves you." But Eleanor quickly cut off the conversation. "Richard, your mother had many problems and thought the best thing for you was to stay with us. She wasn't ready to be a mother." Those words weighed heavily on Richard, who began to feel resentment towards Beatrice. Even so, the seed of doubt had been planted. Each time Richard returned to Charles and Eleanor's house, he was subtly reminded that his mother had abandoned him. Eleanor made sure to reinforce this idea in small daily conversations. "Your mother chose a different life, Richard. We've always been here for you." Richard, confused and hurt, began to build a barrier around his feelings for Beatrice. Every birthday, every school event, every special moment in his life was a painful reminder of his mother's absence. Charles, torn between the truth and his mother's influence, tried to minimize the damage. "Richard, your mother loves you. She always will," he would say, but his words were often drowned out by Eleanor's dominant presence. Beatrice, for her part, never gave up. She continued to send letters, gifts, and messages of love to Richard, hoping that one day he would understand the truth. "My dear Richard, never forget that I love you more than anything in this world," she would write, tears in her eyes. Richard's internal battle between Eleanor's narrative and Beatrice's love continued, creating an emotional conflict that only grew stronger with each passing year. Determined to change her life and rebuild her relationship with Richard, Beatrice threw herself into work. She took on various jobs, from cleaning to working as a shop assistant and even as a construction helper at a local company. Every day was a battle, but she never lost sight of her goal. One sunny afternoon, Beatrice was cleaning tables in the restaurant when her colleague, John, called her over. "Beatrice, I've got an opportunity for you. They're looking for painters on a revitalization project in central London. The pay is good." Beatrice, her eyes shining with hope, accepted the offer without hesitation. "Thank you, John. This could be the chance I need." "There'll be some training for the new painters. I'll recommend you for the job, so don't worry," said John. Working as a painter wasn't easy. It was hard work, requiring physical strength and endurance, but Beatrice was ready to face each wall as if she were painting a better future for herself and Richard. Her thoughts often drifted to her son. "One day, Richard, I'll prove to you that I never abandoned you," she would murmur to herself. Beatrice sat in her small apartment and wrote a letter to Richard. "My dear Richard, not a day goes by when I don't think of you. I'm working very hard so that we can be together again. I hope one day you'll understand and forgive me. With love, Mum." She knew the chances of Richard reading them were slim, but that didn't stop her from writing. It was her way of keeping the connection alive, even from a distance. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood where Richard lived, Eleanor continued to undermine Beatrice's image. "Richard, stop asking about your mother. She never even sent you a letter or gifts. She was never there when you really needed her," she would say, planting doubts in the boy's mind. Even so, Beatrice didn't give up. She enrolled in night courses to learn new skills and improve her job prospects. During one of these classes, she met Sarah, a woman also striving to improve her life. The two quickly became friends and confidants. "Sarah, everything I do is for my son. I want him to see that his mother never gave up on him," Beatrice said one evening as they studied together in a cafe. Sarah, holding Beatrice's hand, replied, "You're one of the strongest people I know, Bea. Richard will see that one day, and when he does, he'll be proud of you." With Sarah's support and her own determination, Beatrice continued her journey. Each day was a step closer to her goal. She saved every penny, dreaming of the day she could offer Richard a safe and loving home. However, the opportunity to work as a painter proved to be a turning point. On a grey, overcast day, Beatrice arrived at the worksite, an old building in the city centre that was being renovated. She wore a white overall stained with paint, and her hair was tied back in a tight bun. She put on a mask to protect herself from the paint fumes. "Good morning, everyone," she said, greeting her co-workers, including John, who had helped her get the job. John smiled and waved back. "Good morning, Beatrice. Ready for a day of hard work?" Beatrice laughed. "Always. Let's make this city more beautiful." As she painted, Beatrice often thought of Richard. Every brushstroke was a reminder of why she was there. The hours passed quickly, and she focused on perfecting every detail, knowing that her effort was bringing her one step closer to her goal. During a lunch break, Beatrice sat with Sarah, who had also managed to get a job on the revitalization project. "How are you feeling today, Bea?" Sarah asked as she opened her sandwich. Beatrice sighed, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Tired, but determined. Working here gives me a sense of purpose. I'm doing something meaningful and saving money at the same time." Sarah nodded, understanding completely. "You're doing an amazing job. Richard will see all the effort you've put in to secure a better future for him." As the weeks turned into months, Beatrice stood out at work. Her skill and dedication didn't go unnoticed. The project supervisor, Mr. Thompson, noticed her hard work and called her in for a conversation. "Beatrice, your work has been exemplary. We're thinking of promoting you to team leader. What do you think?" Beatrice's eyes lit up. "I'd love that, Mr. Thompson. It would mean so much to me." With the new position, Beatrice not only earned more but also had the opportunity to demonstrate her leadership skills. She coordinated the team, ensuring everyone worked efficiently and accurately. Her colleagues respected and admired her determination. One afternoon, while painting a high wall, Beatrice heard laughter and children's voices outside. Looking out the window, she saw a group of children leaving school. Her heart almost stopped. "Richard," she murmured, her eyes filling with tears. Sarah, noticing her friend's emotion, came over. "Bea, are you all right?" Beatrice took a deep breath and smiled through her tears. "Yes, Sarah. I'm just remembering why I'm here, who I'm doing all this for. Seeing those children reminded me of my son. He would be about that age now, coming out of school." At the end of the day, Beatrice returned home exhausted but satisfied. Each day was a small victory. She continued to write letters to Richard, now carefully saving them, waiting for the day when he would read them all and understand how much she had fought for him. Beatrice was still working on the house from the previous day, standing on a ladder, painting the top part of a window, when she again heard the lively sounds of children leaving the nearby school. The afternoon sun lit up the street, and she could hear the laughter and chatter in the distance. She continued her work, but her thoughts were soon interrupted by a familiar voice. "Look at that woman painting," said a boy, pointing in Beatrice's direction. "It looks like she's doing a man's job." Beatrice looked down, and her heart raced as she saw the group of children. A curious boy stepped closer. "Why are you painting if you're a woman?" he asked, with an intrigued expression. Beatrice, trying to control her emotions, carefully climbed down the ladder and responded with a smile. "Because I enjoy painting, it's part of my job." "All right then, I'll tell my friends," the child said as he ran off. The next day, one of the other children, Albert, with a mischievous look, suggested to the friend who had mentioned the woman painter, "Let's give her a scare. It'll be funny." Richard, who was among the children, hesitated. "No, Albert. She's just doing her job. Let's leave her alone." But Albert, ignoring Richard, ran to the house after school, spotted a paint can nearby and kicked it, spilling paint all over the ground. Beatrice, who was painting the exterior, heard the noise and was startled. Thinking something had happened to John, who was on the ladder finishing the exterior, John stepped back due to the scare and nearly fell off the ladder. "Hey, that's not cool!" exclaimed Richard, trying to hold Albert back. "You shouldn't have done that." John, regaining his balance, looked sternly at the boys. "That wasn't funny. It was dangerous. That paint costs money, and look at the mess you've made. You could have hurt yourselves or me, you little troublemakers." Albert shrugged, but Richard looked genuinely sorry. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." John smiled gently at him. "It's all right. Just try to be more careful, okay? What would your parents say if they knew you were causing trouble on the street?" The group of children began to disperse, with Albert being pulled away by other friends. Richard, however, lingered for a moment, looking at John with a thoughtful expression. "Sorry again," he said before finally turning to follow his friends. Beatrice arrived and saw the group of children walking away. She took a deep breath, cleaned up the spilled paint and got back to work. The next day, Richard and his friends gathered in the schoolyard during recess. Albert, still laughing about the previous incident, had a new plan in mind. "Did you see his face yesterday? It was hilarious. Let's play more tricks today." Richard hesitated, remembering what had happened. "Albert, I'm not sure we should. He didn't do anything wrong." Albert rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, Richard. It'll be fun. Are you scared?" Feeling pressured, Richard finally gave in. "All right, but nothing that could hurt him." The group met up after school, at the same corner where they had found John the day before. While Beatrice and her work partner John were busy painting, they heard laughter and quick footsteps. The boys were back, and Albert seemed even more determined to cause trouble. "Look who's back, the troublemakers!" John shouted, seeing the group approach. Beatrice heard John and sighed inwardly, calling out to him. "Let's try to ignore them. Maybe they'll get bored and leave." But the boys had other plans. Albert led the charge, kicking over an open paint can, and with considerable effort managed to push it, spilling paint all over the pavement again. "Hey, what are you doing? Not again, you little brats!" John shouted, irritated. Albert just laughed and, with a defiant look, approached the ladder where John was working. "Let's see if you can stay up there, big guy." Before John could react, Albert pushed the ladder hard. John lost his balance and fell, landing with a dull thud on the ground. Beatrice heard the commotion and ran to see what was happening, but she arrived too late. "John, are you all right?" John groaned, holding his arm. "I think I sprained my wrist." Beatrice turned to the boys, her face a mix of anger and disappointment. "You've gone too far, this isn't a game." Richard, seeing the seriousness of the situation, tried to intervene. "Albert, that was too much. Let's go." Albert, however, wasn't ready to stop. "What's wrong with you? You're just saying that because you're scared." At that moment, Beatrice quickly approached and grabbed Albert by the arm. "That's enough. You need to stop this right now." Albert struggled, and in a fit of anger struck Beatrice in the face, knocking off the mask she wore to protect herself from the paint. The mask fell, revealing her face and hair. Richard, in shock, recognized her instantly. "Mum?" His voice trembled, full of surprise and confusion. Beatrice looked at him, tears in her eyes. "Richard?" The other boys, realizing the seriousness of the situation, began to back away. Albert, still angry, gave one last kick to another paint can before running off. "Mum, is it really you? I didn't know," said Richard with tears beginning to fall. Beatrice pulled him into a tight hug. "That's all right, my love. I know you didn't know. I finally found you, my dear. You've grown so much." Richard, still confused and unsure how to react, hugged his mother while crying. "Mum, why did you leave me?" Beatrice began to cry. "I didn't leave you, my son. I was forbidden from seeing you, but I never stopped looking for you." Beatrice found herself torn between comforting her son and helping her injured friend John on the ground. "My son, I have so much to tell you. I miss you every day. But can you help me with John first? He's hurt," she said, her voice still trembling from the tears. Beatrice helped John to his feet and guided him to a nearby chair. "We need to get you to a doctor." John nodded, his face contorted in pain. "You've found your son. Take some time and take care of yourself now. I can hold on a bit longer." Beatrice looked at Richard, at the mess the boys had made, and then at John, feeling lost. "We need to make sure you're all right first. Richard will help me get you to the car." Beatrice was helping John into the car when she heard more laughter and noise coming from the work site. Her heart tightened. "John, I need to go back. It sounds like the boys haven't left yet." John nodded, trying to hide the pain on his face. "Go, Beatrice. I can wait here." Rushing back to the site, Beatrice saw Albert and some of the other boys still playing with the paint cans and pushing the ladder. "Stop that!" Beatrice shouted, but the boys didn't listen. Seeing that the situation was getting out of control, Beatrice ran towards Albert, who was about to push the ladder again. With a quick movement, she firmly grabbed his arm. "That's enough. You're putting everyone in danger." Albert tried to pull away, but Beatrice didn't let go. "Let me go. You're not the boss of me." Richard, seeing the determination in her eyes, finally found the courage to intervene. "Albert, stop it. She's right. We've gone too far." Albert glared at him. "You're siding with her now, you traitor?" Beatrice released Albert but stayed close, ready to step in again if needed. "Albert, is it? You all need to leave before someone gets really hurt." The other boys, realizing the seriousness of the situation and Richard's bravery, began to back off. Albert, seeing that he was losing his friend's support, finally gave in. "Fine, let's get out of here." As the boys walked away, Beatrice turned to Richard. "Are you all right, my son?" Richard looked at her, his expression full of conflicting emotions. "Why didn't you ever tell me the truth?" Beatrice sighed, feeling the weight of the question. "I tried, Richard, but I never had the chance. They wouldn't let me." Richard looked down, kicking a stone on the pavement. "I didn't know what to think. Grandma always said you abandoned me." Beatrice felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I never abandoned you, Richard. I've always fought for you, and I'm still fighting." Richard finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. "I want to believe you, Mum, but it's so hard." Beatrice hugged him tightly. "I know, darling, but I'm here now and I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together." As they embraced, Beatrice felt a renewed sense of hope. She knew the road to rebuilding Richard's trust would be long, but that moment was an important step in the right direction. And she was determined to keep fighting for her son, no matter what came next. Beatrice and Richard were still hugging when they heard quick footsteps approaching. Albert, furious at being contradicted, came running back towards them. Before anyone could react, he raised his arm and struck Beatrice in the face, causing her to fall to the ground. Richard, shocked, shouted, "Albert, no!" She looked directly at Albert, not with anger, but with deep sadness. Albert, realizing what he had done, froze. I didn't mean to," he stammered, visibly regretful but unsure how to fix the situation. Richard ran to his mother, his eyes filled with tears and anger. "Are you all right, Mum?" Beatrice nodded, trying to hide the pain. "I'm okay, Richard, but we need to talk to this boy. He's crossed all the lines." Albert took a step back, his fists still clenched, but his expression showed more fear than aggression. I thought you were betraying us, Richard. I just wanted to protect you." Richard shook his head, feeling a mix of compassion and frustration. "Albert, my mum never abandoned me. She's always been fighting for me." Beatrice, taking a deep breath, stepped forward and extended her hand to Albert. "Albert, we all make mistakes. I understand that you were confused and angry, but violence is never the answer." Albert looked at Beatrice's outstretched hand, hesitating before finally accepting the gesture of peace. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. Richard always said bad things about you." Beatrice smiled sadly. "I know, and that's why I'm here, to show the truth and make up for the lost time with my son." The other boys, who had stepped back when Albert attacked, were now slowly approaching, watching the scene with curiosity and apprehension. One of them, braver than the rest, asked, "So you're Richard's mum and you're not as bad as we thought?" Beatrice shook her head. "No, I'm not. All I've ever wanted was to be with Richard and give him the love and care he deserves." Richard, holding his mother's hand, looked at his friends. "My mum is a good person, and I don't want to hide that anymore." Albert, still recovering from the shock, finally spoke. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Beatrice. I just wanted to protect Richard, but I ended up doing everything wrong." With the tension easing, Beatrice and Richard knew they still had a long way to go, but that moment marked the beginning of a new phase. Together, they were ready to face the challenges and rebuild their relationship one step at a time. Beatrice, feeling a mix of relief and sadness, simply nodded. "Richard, I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a moment." Richard stepped back, his conflicting emotions evident on his face. "But Grandma always said you abandoned me. She said you didn't care." Beatrice held his hands firmly, looking directly into his eyes. "Richard, I never abandoned you. I've always loved you and fought for you. Your grandmother, she was wrong about many things. She misled you." Albert, still shaken by the confrontation, looked at Richard. "She's telling the truth, mate. You can see it in her eyes." Richard, struggling with confusion and pain, remembered all the moments when he missed having a mother. He had always felt a void he couldn't explain, a need for love that was never fully satisfied. "I don't know what to think," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Beatrice pulled Richard into a tight hug. I know it's hard, my love, and I know it will take time for you to understand everything. But I'm here now, and I'll do everything to prove that I've always loved you. Tears finally fell from Richard's eyes. I want to believe you, Mum. I want to understand. Beatrice stroked his hair, whispering, You will understand, Richard. We'll work through this together. I promise. With the truth finally revealed, Richard's recognition of Beatrice as his mother was the first step towards healing and rebuilding the relationship they both so desperately wanted. And so, under the afternoon sun, mother and son reunited. The other boys, realizing the moment was intimate and personal, began to back away, giving them space. Albert, however, hesitated before leaving. Richard, I'm sorry for everything. I just wanted to protect you. Beatrice knew she needed to handle the situation appropriately to ensure everyone's safety. She stepped away from Richard for a moment, picking up her phone. Richard, I need to call the police. What Albert did was serious, and we need to handle this responsibly. My friend John could have been hurt much worse. Richard looked at her, a mix of understanding and concern on his face. I get it, Mum. Albert was wrong, but he's my friend. Do you think he'll go to jail? Beatrice sighed, knowing it was a complicated situation. I don't know, Richard, but it's important for everyone to know that actions have consequences. He needs to understand that. She dialed the number and waited as the phone rang. When the operator answered, she calmly explained the situation, reporting the assault and property damage. Yes, I'm at a work site, and there's been an incident involving minors. We need immediate assistance. While they waited for the police to arrive, the other boys kept their distance, watching with anxiety. Albert looked remorseful but also scared of the possible consequences of his actions. Beatrice, still holding Richard's hand, approached Albert. Albert, I know you're sorry, but what you did can't be ignored. The police will come, and your parents will have to take responsibility for you. Albert nodded, tears streaming down his face. I'm really sorry, Mrs. Beatrice. I truly am. A short while later, a police car arrived. 2 officers got out and approached, assessing the scene. Good afternoon. We received a call about an assault. What happened here? Beatrice stepped forward, keeping her voice steady. This boy, Albert, assaulted me, knocked my colleague off a ladder and caused damage to the worksite. He's remorseful, but we need to make sure he understands the seriousness of his actions. The officers looked at Albert, who was visibly trembling. We'll have a talk with him, said one of the officers, taking Albert aside to get his details. Meanwhile, the other officer spoke with Beatrice and Richard. Are you both all right? Do you need any medical attention? Beatrice shook her head. We're fine, thank you. We just want to resolve this in the best way possible. Richard, seeing the seriousness of the situation, held his mother's hand more tightly. Mum, I don't want Albert to go to jail. Beatrice crouched down to meet Richard's eyes. I know, sweetheart, and maybe that won't happen. But we need to show that what he did was wrong, so that he and the other boys learn an important lesson. After a few minutes, the officers returned with Albert, who was now calmer. We'll call his parents and explain the situation. They'll have to deal with the consequences of his actions. Beatrice nodded, relieved. Thank you, officers. After the police had left and the situation was under control, Beatrice and Richard sat on a nearby bench, away from the confusion and the painful memories of the incident. Beatrice knew it was time to tell Richard the whole truth, without hiding anything. Richard, there are many things you need to know, Beatrice began, her voice filled with emotion. I never wanted to leave you. When your father and I separated, your grandmother, Eleanor, did everything she could to make sure I lost custody of you. She used lies and manipulation to keep me away. Richard looked at his mother, his eyes reflecting pain and confusion. But why would she do that? Why would she lie to me? Beatrice took a deep breath, holding Richard's hands firmly. She always thought I wasn't good enough for their family. Your grandmother believed that because I came from a humble background, I couldn't give you what you needed. But Richard, everything I've done since you were born has been for you. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. Did you try to see me? Try to contact me? Every single day, my love, Beatrice said, tears falling. I wrote letters, sent gifts, tried every possible way, but your grandmother intercepted everything. She wanted you to believe that I had abandoned you, but I never gave up on you." Richard started to cry, feeling the pain and frustration that had built up over the years. "I missed you so much, Mum. There was always this emptiness inside me that nothing could fill." Beatrice pulled him into a tight hug, whispering in his ear, "I missed you too, Richard. Every day without you was torture, but I never lost hope that we'd be together again." Richard, wiping his tears and looking at his mother with determination, said, "I want to stay with you, Mum. I want to make up for lost time." Beatrice smiled, her heart filling with hope and joy. "We will, Richard. We'll rebuild our lives together, step by step, and no one will ever separate us again." As they walked back towards Richard's home, Beatrice shared more about her life, her struggles, and her victories. Richard listened intently, feeling closer to her with every word. "You're so strong, Mum. I'm so proud of you. Beatrice stroked Richard's face, her eyes shining with love. "And I'm so proud of you, my son. You're the reason I never gave up." As they neared Richard's home, Beatrice said goodbye for the moment. "Don't tell anyone you found me, son, or they might try to keep us apart again. Come back tomorrow to where you found me and I'll tell you more." The next day, Beatrice showed Richard the letters she had written to him over the years, and he read each one carefully, feeling the love and dedication of his mother in every word. "I want us to be a real family," Richard said, holding one of the letters. "I want to make up for every moment we lost." Beatrice nodded, emotional. "We will, Richard, and we'll create new memories together. The past can't be changed, but the future is in our hands." From that moment on, Beatrice and Richard began to reconnect emotionally, healing the wounds of the past and building a stronger bond than ever before. The road ahead still had challenges, but together, mother and son were ready to face anything that came their way, determined never to be separated again. After their emotional reconciliation, Beatrice knew she needed to secure the legal right to be with Richard. Determined to reclaim her place in her son's life, she began gathering all the evidence needed to reopen the custody case. The next morning, Beatrice scheduled a meeting with her family lawyer, Laura, who had helped with other matters in the past. Sitting in the small office, Beatrice explained the whole situation, from the separation to the recent reconnection with Richard. Laura, an experienced and compassionate woman, listened carefully. "Beatrice, I know this is extremely difficult for you, but we'll need solid evidence to challenge the current custody arrangement. Do you have any documentation that could help us?" Beatrice opened a folder full of documents, receipts, undelivered letters, and other records showing her efforts to stay in contact with Richard. "Here's everything, Laura. I never stopped trying." Laura examined the documents, nodding. "This is a good start. We'll also need testimonies. Perhaps friends, neighbors, anyone who can attest to your character and your efforts as a mother." Beatrice thought of Sarah, John, and other work colleagues who knew her story. "I have some people who can help. They know how hard I've fought." With Laura's support, Beatrice began the legal process. The first hearing was scheduled quickly, for 2 weeks later. During this time, Beatrice felt a mix of nervousness and determination. Richard, now understanding the situation better, was also anxious but confident in his mother's love. On the day of the hearing, Beatrice sat next to Laura, waiting for her turn to speak. Eleanor, with a disdainful expression, was present, along with Charles, who looked divided and sad. Richard sat next to his father, staring at his mother, silently rooting for her. Laura began the argument. "Your Honor, we are here to prove that Mrs. Beatrice has never abandoned her son. We have evidence and testimonies that show her continuous efforts to maintain contact and support Richard, completely contradicting the accounts given in the original custody hearing years ago. My client's conduct as a mother, who was unjustly separated from her son, has been heartbreaking and overwhelming, and throughout this time, we have proof that she has fought for him every single day." The judge, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, examined the documents presented. "Let's hear the testimonies." Sarah was the first to testify. "I've known Beatrice for years. She's always spoken about Richard with so much love and longing. I've seen how much she suffered being away from him and how hard she fought to improve her life." John, the co-worker who had helped her get the painting job, also testified. Beatrice is one of the most dedicated people I know. She's done everything she could to get her son back and be a good mother, even under the most difficult circumstances. Beatrice also had the chance to speak. Her voice choked with emotion. She said, "I love my son more than anything. I never abandoned him and I'll never give up on him. All I want is the chance to be present in his life and make up for lost time. There wasn't a day that went by that I didn't think of him or write to him so he would remember me." Eleanor tried to counter, arguing that Richard was better off in her care. "I just wanted the best for my grandson. Beatrice never had the means to care for him. She doesn't now either." The judge listened carefully to both sides before making his decision. "After considering all the evidence and testimonies, I grant Mrs. Beatrice supervised visitation rights. This is the first step in restoring the relationship between mother and son. From here, we can assess progress and consider future revisions to custody." Beatrice felt immense relief, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Your Honor, thank you." Richard ran to her, hugging her tightly. "We'll make it, Mum." With supervised visitation rights secured, Beatrice and Richard spent more time together, cherishing each moment to strengthen their bond. Each visit was an opportunity for Richard to better understand his mother's story and for Beatrice to show her unconditional love. One weekend, while walking in the park, Richard looked at his mother seriously. "Mum, I've been thinking a lot. I want to live with you. I want to be with you all the time." Beatrice stopped, surprised and emotional. "Are you sure, Richard? I know it's a big decision. You'll be leaving a lot behind." Richard nodded firmly. "I'm sure. I know Grandma tried to protect me in her way, but I want to be with you. I want a life with you." Beatrice felt a wave of joy and concern. "We'll talk to the lawyer, Richard. Let's see what we can do." The following week, Beatrice and Richard met again with Laura, the family lawyer. "Laura, Richard wants to live with me. What do we need to do to make that happen?" Laura looked at Richard, smiling. "If that's really what you want, Richard, we'll need to file a new request with the court. We'll need more evidence that you'll be better off with your mother." Richard, determined, replied, "I'm ready to do whatever it takes." The hearing was scheduled for a few weeks later. During that time, Beatrice and Richard continued to build their relationship, while Laura prepared the case. On the day of the hearing, Richard was nervous but confident. He knew he was doing the right thing. In court, he spoke directly to the judge. "Your Honor, I want to live with my mum. I love her and want to be with her. I know my grandma tried to take care of me, but I need my mum in my life." Eleanor, with a stern expression, tried to argue, "Richard, you don't understand. I only want what's best for you." Richard looked at his grandmother with respect but firmness. "I know, Grandma, but what's best for me is to be with my mum. I need that." Beatrice, with tears in her eyes, added, "Your Honor, I'm ready to take care of Richard full-time. I have a stable job, a safe home, and most importantly, unconditional love for my son." The judge, after listening to all the arguments, paused before announcing his decision. "Considering Richard's wishes and the circumstances presented, I grant primary custody to Mrs. Beatrice. Richard, you will be able to live with your mother. However, Mrs. Eleanor will have regular visitation rights." Richard ran to hug his mother, tears streaming down his face. "Let's go home, Mum. We're finally going home." Beatrice held Richard tightly, feeling an indescribable joy. "Yes, my love. Let's go home." As they left the courtroom, Eleanor, though sad, approached Beatrice. "Take good care of him, Beatrice. I only want what's best for Richard, and if anything happens, make sure I'll see you in prison." Beatrice nodded, holding Richard's hand. "I know exactly how to take care of my son." Charles, who was nearby, tried to speak. I don't want to hear your voice, Charles," Beatrice interrupted. "You went from being the love of my life to my biggest disappointment. You were never a real man. You're the father of my son, but I'll never listen to you again. All these years made me hate you more than I ever thought I could. You were the only one who could have done something, and you ruined our son's childhood growing up without his mother." And so Richard and Beatrice began a new chapter in their lives, united by love and determined never to be separated again. The future was uncertain, but together they knew they could face any challenge. This story shows that nothing in the world can cool a mother's love, and that the truth will always come to light no matter how much it is hidden. With faith and hard work, everything can be resolved.